is right here.
Oh. Hi.
Is Chrissy? Mom, is Chrissy on her way? Yes. If she's late, we can pull up another chair. Here's what I'm gonna do. Hey, she gets here. I'm gonna pull one more chair.
Oh, there's already 2 people on the screen. I'm sitting there.
Well,
Rocky, there's a seat right here. Sit around.
Yeah.
we can get another chair.
No, wait, I wanted to sit on the ground.
Like none of these things. That's okay. I'm going to turn it down 1 more degree.
You did.
I love your country. Thank you.
Apparently you're popular.
They all like make happy for
Yeah, there you go. This is not what I thought. I've never been intimidated.
No, yeah, I was thinking that. I was like, yeah.
Layla, will you put your right hand up? Just put a hand up. Okay, it's really laggy, but it's like, or it's really behind, but it's okay because they want to know.
If you guys need chairs, we can bring a few more in. This is great. Oh, you guys?
Except even though I just said it on the last stream.
Let's go ahead. Welcome everyone to day 2 of the Senior Honors Thesis Defenses. If you like strong women, this is the day to be here, okay? I'm just telling you the truth. These 2 young ladies I've worked with for the last 4 years. Well, technically Layla 3.5. I kind of knew her indirectly through mom for a long time. So it is special to have Layla here. This is my first graduate that I actually taught mother and daughter. So that's special for me personally, and also showing that maybe I'm in the twilight of my career. But 2 great topics today. We have Layla and Preeti looking at voter suppression, and then followed by declining U.S. hegemony and the rise of China. Again, projects that I think you will be, just spellbound to hear their presentations, the amount of work they put into this over the past year. This topic, of course, is very fluid, ever changing throughout the school year, and again, very, very timely topic. Without further ado, let's give it up for Layla Al-Mashari.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Layla Al-Mashari. Today, I'm going to be talking about voter suppression and the uncomfortable truth of American democracy. So the purpose of my project was to explore the history of voting rights in America and analyze current voter suppression trends, as well as the threat that they pose to our democracy. Due to the relevance of my topic today, a lot of literature is constantly being published about it. Some of the books I found most helpful were Give Us the Ballot by R.E. Berman, One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson, and The Right to Vote by Alexander Kaiser. Because my topic is also so new and current, there's lots of scholarly analysis being published each day. Some organizations and databases I found the most helpful were the Pew Research Center, the Brennan Center for Justice, and the Supreme Court cases themselves. So starting with the history of voting rights, the Declaration of Independence proclaims that the government should rule by the consent of the people. Now, this consent was given through voting. However, the limitations of who was able to vote prevented this ideal from being realized. Because the language of the original Constitution does not specifically list voting as a right, it was viewed as a privilege, to be granted and limited by the whims of politicians. The Constitution also granted authority over elections to the states, paving the way for votes to be denied and diluted. Due to the power state legislatures had over the election, only 6% of the U.S. population was able to vote in the first presidential election. Now, only property owners over the age of 21 were allowed to vote, which meant the right to vote was limited almost exclusively to the white male. By 1856, all states had removed property requirements on the right to vote. And in the aftermath of the Civil War and with the passage of the 14th Amendment, voting became a constitutional right. However, due to the power states still held over voting, many states continued to deny this right to Black citizens. It soon became apparent that in order for the constitutional right to be realized, federal intervention was needed. This led to the passage of the 15th Amendment. In order to circumvent the new amendment, Southern legislatures began a crackdown on voting rights under the disguise of race-neutral legislation. Such legislation had the intent and effect of disenfranchising minority voters, particularly Black voters, leading to only 3% of eligible Black voters being registered by the year 1940. One of the most well-known race-neutral attacks on voting rights was the creation of poll taxes. Now, these taxes demanded 2% of annual income for many Black citizens, and as weekly incomes barely covered the cost of necessities, many citizens simply could not afford to exercise their constitutional right to vote. In addition, literacy tests, education requirements, and understanding clauses became additional ways to disproportionately disenfranchise Black and minority voters, while eluding the guarantees of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Voters were asked to determine things as absurd as how many grains of sand are on a beach. Then, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. However, contentious debate over the act led to necessary voting protections being deleted. After the Civil Rights Act was passed, civil rights leaders across the country began demanding for a comprehensive voting rights bill. Throughout 1964 and 1965, protests mounted, and although marches occurred weekly, the fight for voting rights seemed to be at a political standstill until March 7, 1965, which became known as Bloody Sunday. That Sunday, as protesters in Selma, Alabama marched for their voting rights, they were met by local law enforcement and state troopers who threw tear gas at them and brutally beat them with whips, chains, and sticks. The public outcry in the wake of Bloody Sunday would lead to the passage of a comprehensive voting rights bill, which would change the history of voting rights in America and briefly strengthen American democracy. The VRA is an act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution and was signed into law on August 6, 1965. The VRA protected the right to vote through two principal mechanisms: the right of private citizens to bring lawsuits under Section 2, and the right of the federal government to approve changes to voting laws and practices in states with a history of voter disenfranchisement under Section 5, which directly inserted the federal government into elections. It became evident that the VRA was working. Black voter registration increased tremendously from 6% in 1964 to 59% in 1969. The state legislative effort shifted from outright denial of the voting rights of minorities to extreme measures designed to make the vote of minority citizens inconsequential. Racial gerrymandering became a popular means to do so and was quickly adopted by many state legislatures through the mechanisms of cracking and packing. Now, cracking divided districts so that minorities would be spread over multiple districts, thereby denying them the power to cast their ballot for a majority in a single district, while packing drew district lines so that minority voters would be relegated to a single district. It became clear that voter suppression tactics were shifting from purely racial considerations to political ones too. Due to the narrow margin of Bush's victory in Florida in 2011 presidential elections, Gore demanded a recount. This recount highlighted a number of issues in the Florida's process of administering elections, including the purge of voter registration rolls and racial issues that continued to plague elections. It would later be revealed that in the flaws of the purge methodology would wrongly move 12,000 voters from the Florida voter rolls, half of whom were Black. In the presidential election that was determined by 537 votes, the votes of those 12,000 Floridians mattered. Nationwide, many elections began to be contentious. Any suggestions of voting issues or Democratic victories were met with accusations by the Republican Party of fraud and calls to defend the integrity of the electoral process. Although actual fraud by voter casting and ballot proved to be rare, issues related to the administration of elections proved to be rampant. For example, in New Jersey, allegations of voter fraud arose because 2 ballots were cast by the name Kathleen Sullivan. However, an investigation revealed that the 2 women shared the name Kathleen Sullivan as well as the same birthday. The political impetus and racial implications of voter identification laws is easily observed in Texas. The new laws limited. Similarly, an investigation into allegations of deceased individuals voting in Maryland found that the individuals were alive at the time they voted. These instances are not issues of actual fraud perpetrated by voters on the electoral system, but issues with the administration of elections. As Professor Menite argues, suppressing the opposition's vote is often a more attractive strategy than mobilizing new voters. This is because voter suppression leaves a party's electoral coalition intact, whereas mobilizing new voters can destabilize the coalition by incorporating new groups that may be at odds with those already in the coalition. Actions by the Republican Party to protect the U.S. electoral system from fraud would only further encourage efforts to suppress the votes of minorities. The power of minority voters was unquestionable with the election of President Obama as the 44th President of the United States. The 2008 election resulted in a record number of voters, 131 million people, and a record number of minority voters cast a ballot, overwhelmingly for President Obama. Recognizing the power of this new predominantly minority Democratic voting bloc, Republican politicians were left with 2 choices: reconfigure their stance on social and economic issues to attract more minority voters, or dilute or eliminate minorities from the electorate. Unwilling or unable to change their policies, Republicans devised a strategy to systemically disenfranchise minority voters. Republican strategists realized that congressional districts could be redrawn to silence minority votes, but in order to do so, they needed to control the state legislatures who were responsible for drawing district maps. The strategy would become known as Redistricting Majority Project, or REDMAP, and resulted in the largest, most organized, and most effective gerrymandering efforts to date. If used correctly, redistricting is one of the most powerful tools for a true representative democracy. Unfortunately, redistricting can lead to gerrymandering. Once the Republicans gained control of many state legislatures, they were able to use this control to draw district lines that would make the votes of minorities inconsequential or diluted. The 2012 elections and redistricting had a dramatic effect. Many of the Democratic policies of the Obama administration were effectively blocked because the U.S. House of Representatives was controlled by the Republicans. As Republican legislators embarked on a political scheme to disenfranchise minority voters, they found an unlikely ally, the Supreme Court. In 2013, the court ruled that the VRA's coverage formula was unconstitutional because it violated states' rights. Chief Justice John Roberts placed the rights of states to regulate elections as paramount to the right of the federal government to protect voting practices and policies from discrimination, and reasoned that the pre-clearance requirement was so effective in removing discriminatory blocks to voting that it was simply no longer needed. However, Justice Ginsburg maintained that Congress had the power to protect voting rights. She argued that throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. The court's opinion effectively eliminated any power that the VRA had to prevent discriminatory voting practices. After the court's decision in Shelby County, the only legal remedy available to prevent discrimination in voting procedure is private lawsuits under Section 2 of the VRA. However, lawsuits under Section 2 of the VRA are burdensome, expensive, time-consuming, and occur only after the discriminatory law has already been in effect. In the weeks after Shelby County was decided, numerous states passed legislation to make the right to vote more difficult for minority voters. Following the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County, state legislatures were no longer deterred or restricted by the VRA's pre-clearance requirements and enacted laws designed to make voting more difficult, predominantly for Black and minority citizens. As of January 2022, laws were passed in 27 state legislatures to restrict the voting rights of citizens. Notably, all states that were previously covered by the VRA's pre-clearance requirements have passed voter suppression laws after Shelby County. Today's voter suppression laws have predominantly been passed by Republican legislatures in states with a growing minority electorate. Modern-day voter suppression laws and policies target all facets of the electoral system, from voter registration to election day procedures. The laws and practices can be separated into 3 main categories: laws that make it harder to register to vote, laws that make it harder to vote, and laws that make the strength of one's vote inconsequential. Voter registration is a mechanism in which individuals register to vote. While many Republican states have enacted laws that make voter registration more difficult and have eliminated laws and policies that permitted same-day voter registration, states have passed laws that place restrictions on organizations that help citizens register to vote. Black and minority citizens are twice as likely to register to vote through third-party registration initiatives. Once voters are registered, they must stay on their voter registration rolls. In many states, under Republican leadership, voter purge laws and policies have become more aggressive and disproportionately impact Black and minority voters. Georgia aggressive voter purge resulted in 1.5 million voters being removed from the rolls. Black voters comprised of 64% of voters that were removed from the registration rolls. That was 8 times greater than white voters. The number of individuals that are prevented from voting because of a felony disenfranchisement law is not inconsequential. As of 2020, the number of individuals who are disenfranchised as a result of a felony was 5.17 million. Nationwide, as of 2020, 6.2% of Black voting age individuals are barred from voting because of a felony disenfranchisement law, compared to only 1.7% of non-Black voters. Prior to 2006, there was not a single state that required an individual to prevent a form of identification in order to vote. As of January 2020, 35 states have enacted legislation that requires some type of identification in order to cast a ballot. 9% of Black voters and 9% of Hispanic voters lack the proper identification to vote in the 2016 presidential election. State legislatures justify voter identification laws as necessary to protect elections from fraud. However, voter identification laws can only prevent an individual from casting a ballot as someone else at the polls themselves, which occurred only 31 times out of over 1 billion votes cast in the U.S. elections between 2000 and 2014. Therefore, as Professor Carol Anderson argues, the goal of all the GOP voter ID laws is to reduce significantly the demographic and political impact of the growing shares of the American electorate. The political impetus and racial implications of voter identification is easily observed in Texas. The new laws limited the acceptable forms of identification. At the passage of these laws, 600,000 Black and minority registered voters could not meet the new voter identification requirements, and an additional 1 million potential voters did not possess the necessary identification. In order to obtain a satisfactory Texas identification, Sammy Bates, who lived off of $321 a month, was required to obtain a copy of her Mississippi birth certificate for $42. As Ms. Bates explained, I had to put the $42 where it was doing the most good. It was feeding my family because we couldn't eat a birth certificate, and we couldn't pay rent with a birth certificate, so I just wrote it off. Because there is a financial burden in securing even a free voter identification card, voter identification laws have been identified as the modern-day poll tax. As a result of the unprecedented number of absentee ballots cast during the COVID-19 pandemic, states have recently enacted or proposed legislation making this practice more difficult. For example, in 2021, Texas enacted a law that required absentee voters to provide either their driver's license number or a partial social security number while submitting an absentee ballot. In the 2022 Texas primary election, 13% of absentee ballots were rejected, an astronomical rate compared to the 0.8% of absentee ballots rejected nationally in the 2020 presidential election. Notably, a New York Times investigation found that Black and minority communities had a ballot rejection rate of 44% higher than white voters. In addition, early voting rights expand access to the polls for all citizens. However, this practice is particularly popular among Black and minority voters. In some areas, as many as 70% of Black voters cast their ballot during early voting. Restricting early voting substantially impacts community initiatives such as Souls to the Polls, in which Black churches coordinate transportation to polling places on Sunday after church services. These initiatives have been an instrumental step in increasing Black and minority electorate participation. By restricting early voting opportunities, Republican lawmakers have increased the burden on Black and minority voters to such an extent that, unfortunately, many of these voters simply abstain from voting at all. One of the greatest costs of voting is the amount of time it takes for an individual to cast a vote. The equation is straightforward. The more polling places available in a community, the less time it takes to vote. Between 2012 and 2018, 1,688 polling places were closed. Not surprisingly, these closures occurred predominantly in minority communities. As a result, Black and minority voters wait nearly double the amount of time to cast their ballot. Republicans have become particularly adept in gerrymandering to disenfranchise Black and minority voters. Modern gerrymandering efforts are largely drawn on partisan grounds, but because of the racially polarized makeup of the American electorate, partisan gerrymandering has become a powerful tool to identify and dilute the strength of Black and minority voters. The cumulative effect of these laws is ultimately to weaken American democracy. The U.S. democracy is faltering. In 3 global studies of democracy, the U.S. has seen a steady decline in the democracy index. Rather than a true democracy, in recent years, the U.S. has demonstrated increasingly authoritarian tendencies. Competitive authoritarian regimes are described as a system of governments in which formal democratic institutions are the principal means of exercising authority, but those in power violate those roles so that the government fails to meet conventional minimum standards for democracy. The 2020 presidential election has been referred to by many as a low point of American democracy. Trump's insistence on a stolen election and the subsequent January 6th attacks threatened the concept of a free and fair election, the separation of power, and the peaceful transfer of power that support and legitimize U.S. democracy. The attack began weeks and months prior when President Trump and his Republican allies began calling mail-in ballots fraudulent and ordered state elections to stop counting ballots at all. The attacks began even before that when Republican legislatures across the country began adopting voter suppression laws and practices. So the question remains, how do we fight for democracy? First and foremost, Congress must take the lead in restoring voting rights. Acts such as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act must be passed in order for real meaningful change to occur. In terms of registration, states should adopt automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, and online voter registration. Aggressive and discriminatory voter purge practices should be eliminated as a whole. States should utilize reliable systems and establish clear standards before removing a voter from the registration rolls. At the very least, officials should be required to provide notice to a voter that he or she or they are removed from the rolls. Voter identification laws should be amended to expand the list of acceptable identification and to permit individuals without identification to vote based on a sworn statement. The opportunities for mail-in voting and early voting must be expanded to better reflect voting trends. Furthermore, action must be taken to ensure that every vote counts. The practice of partisan gerrymandering must be eliminated. States should utilize independent redistricting commissions and comprise of representatives of both political parties, as well as members of the community, in order to draw district lines. Moreover, the census must be designed to count all individuals, including children and non-citizens. Recent elections have made clear that the electoral college system is no longer operating to advance democracy and denies voters equality and ability to meaningfully elect their president. As the political and demographic makeup of the country changes, it is becoming more and more likely that a candidate who receives the most electoral college votes will not receive the most popular votes. Only 5 times in history has the winner of the electoral college lost the popular vote. Now, 2 of these instances have occurred in the last 2 decades, with the election of President George W. Bush and Donald Trump. Although dismantling the electoral college entirely would require a constitutional amendment, which is unlikely in today's political climate, states can and should enact legislation to pledge their electoral college votes to the candidate who receives and wins the nationwide popular vote. Finally, the most powerful tool against voter suppression is the people. As co-founder of Give Us the Ballot, Cliff Albright observes, in 2020, we didn't win because there was no voter suppression. We won and had massive black turnout because we had to work to make that happen. It's not that we win things because there is no suppression. We win things because we're able to overcome it. Education efforts must be expanded to ensure that every citizen is aware of their voting rights and how to utilize these rights. Citizens need to be educated as to how to register and requirements they will meet in order to cast their ballot, whether at the polls on election day or through an absentee voting mechanism. Voter suppression is truly and unfortunately American. Voter suppression can become convoluted when buzzwords like fraud become the focus, but in reality, the subject is simple if you acknowledge the patterns. The mechanisms are constantly evolving, but the goal is the same. Limit the power of those most likely to oppose you while consolidating your own. Voter suppression is adaptable and able to be molded to fit around each new obstacle. So when poll taxes were deemed inappropriate, strict and impossible voter ID laws became acceptable. When literacy tests could no longer be used to control the registration process, strict registration requirements were enacted to increase the burden on voters. When minorities were finally given access to the ballot box, polling places were closed in their neighborhoods. Regardless of the form, voter suppression denies citizens of a fundamental democratic principle, and action must be taken if American democracy stands a chance. Thank you.
Is there a nefarious force out there that is pulling the strings of all of this? Is this a purposeful strategy of the Republican Party at the national level, or is it more done by a state-by-state basis? The Koch brothers, who's the puppet master of all of this? Did you find any evidence of where this is coming from?
So I would say, I think, and my committee can obviously attest to this, a lot of times I mention the Republican Party in passing certain legislation that's making voter suppression more rampant. Not to say that, there's plenty of gerrymandering instances with Democrats as well. But I think that the Republican Party has a lot less minority participation in it, which leads to a lot of the practices of consolidating power going against the minority electorate. So I would say, to answer your question, I guess, the Republican Party has more presence in passing voter suppression laws and tactics.
No evidence that there was a particular strategy at work or anything like that?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious after Shelby County, it really fell into the hands of the states more so once the federal government lost that protection over it. But at the same time, you have to put some blame on the Supreme Court too for making that decision and allowing that to happen.
Second question, what role does the media play in promulgating this and promoting voter suppression, especially conservative news outlets and such?
This is something I wish I would have had more time to talk about because I think it's really interesting how, especially over the last couple of decades, media has really become a way for misinformation to be spread at a much more legitimate rate and outlet. I think that, as I mentioned a little bit with this new idea of voter fraud, there's so much doubt put into the electoral process that it's harder to make process because people don't want to believe these changes are happening.
I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleagues, Mr. Simmons or Ms. Beard, whoever wants to jump in next.
Go ahead.
I have a state level question. Given that the Constitution protects the right of states to manage the election process, and also given some evidence of a coordinated strategy to influence the state laws and the state apparatus that manages and governs elections, what kind of strategies could an organized group take to counter the state level apparatus that governs elections?
I would say that's kind of when I was talking about acts like the John Lewis Act and the For the People Act. They restore a lot of those federal protections over states. So I would argue that although that kind of goes past the state, it's necessary for keeping the states in check.
Anthony, go ahead.
So, given that based on, at least in this election cycle, those two acts are pretty much dead in the water because the Senate balance. What can people, and these are predominantly red states, do to try to challenge it at a local level? Like, what would you suggest be a first step to try to shift state laws actually within the state?
Honestly, and this answer is easier said than done, I really feel that the most important thing would be mobilizing new voters, predominantly minority voters, because those votes have the power to make a huge, huge difference in national and statewide policies and laws. But if they're not being heard, there's no chance for progress to be made. So I would say mobilizing new voters, like fighting for more polling places, sending requests for updating machinery, and making sure that your ballot's being properly cast, making sure that you know your rights and are educated about your rights. So more community outreach, honestly, about educating people what their voting rights are and how to exercise those rights, I think is the most instrumental thing that we can do.
Kind of a follow-up to that. You talked about how this has been politicized, how this has become a rhetorical tool to mobilize certain groups. So now that it has been politicized, is there a way to address it that isn't going to further polarize? Did you come across anything of how can you message this so that we move forward on allowing people ballot access without feeding the narrative and the polarization?
That question's kind of interesting because I remember when I was originally writing my prospectus and everything, I had said very clearly, this can't be we need to make people know that it's not not just a race issue or it's not just a class issue. But after I've done my project, I realized that it really is. There's not really an easy way to get around that. That just kind of is the way that it is. Like, these laws are very, very, very targeted. And I think that in the beginning, I was like, oh, maybe if we make everyone aware of it, they'll care. No, because they are aware, and this is very intentional. So I think your question is hard. That's why it's hard to make the people actually empowered care, which is why I think that through mobilizing new voters and hopefully being able to get more minorities elected into office positions, like, that change will be possible through them.
Layla, you've done a fantastic job. It was always very difficult to find problems in your writing and thesis. I mean, you are phenomenal with self-editing, and I'm very proud of you. So in 2008, we had, of course, the election of Barack Obama and some of the highest turnouts for minority voters. And then 2 years later, with the 2010 census, it was pretty much determined that sometime in this decade, that there would no longer be a white majority. Between those two events, what do you think played a more significant role in some of the voter suppression acts over the past decade?
I think, sorry, that's a good question. I think it's very interesting when you're looking at the trends of our makeup of, like, the census counts. But what I think is more interesting is just because what used to be referred to as the minority is going to become the majority does not mean that the laws and practices in place to disenfranchise these people are changing at all. So just because Black voters are becoming equal or have the potential to grow more so than white voters in the electorate doesn't change the fact that they don't have access to polling places. It doesn't change the fact that their ballots are removed at a higher rate. It doesn't change the fact that they're kicked off the voter purges or they can't afford identification in order to register to vote. So I would argue that as far as, like, the growing number, it wouldn't have as great as effect as actually mobilizing them to vote.
And kind of as a follow-up to that, of course, we just had our 2020, recently had our 2020 census, and we see a lot of gerrymandering, of course, as a result of that. How impactful do you think that some of those outcomes will be over the next decade?
I think that the
Or
2020
into the future?
census was so harmful to American democracy in ways that we're not even seeing yet, in ways that will continue to affect us. I think that's kind of what I was saying, like, non-citizens, children, everyone needs to be counted accurately, or you can't have a true representative democracy. I think that the potential that the census has is fantastic. If you're able to identify what your electorate is made up of, I think that's amazing. And I think that opens a lot of opportunities for understanding your electorate more and what they want and their needs. But I think that if it's continued to go the way that it has been in the past, especially in recent years, then meaningful change isn't going to be made because those people still aren't being represented.
Let's open up for the, I've got one more question, but I want to open up to the audience first.
So you talked a little bit about AVR, and in my research, it said that
AVR is
automatic
automatic
voter registration. In my research, it said that turnout rates among people registered through AVR were significantly lower. Would that impact your approach and your suggestions, or does that not even matter in implementing AVR?
So I'm not sure I'm not sure exactly what sources you're referring to, but I know a lot of mine were talking about automatic voter registration was actually a great way of mobilizing new voters. And they were having, like, you can get a lot of voters by automatic voter registration. And I think it's a fantastic way to register new voters. So I wanted to clarify that, but what was the rest of your question?
So if turnout rates are lower among people registered through automatic voter registration, does that change your approach to suggesting it, or does that not matter and it's just a matter of principle?
I would say any opportunities to expand the electorate is applicable. I think that no matter how small the number of people registering to vote is, that's still a number that you want to have had before. So whether it's going out into the communities and having voter registration drives, or doing drives at school for voter registration, or automatic voter registration, or online voter registration, or through mail, like any aspect or any form that you can get is something that will get a couple more votes, which are so important. Oh, okay.
No, you go. Okay, you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of community-based initiatives like these Souls to the Polls. But given that you said earlier that there were a lot of these costs that restrict them from getting documents in the first place, do you think that it would be more effective for them to open up more initiatives that give these communities more access to getting these documents, or getting them to the polls?
I think kind of both. I think the thing that's really helpful about these community initiatives is a lot of time that it takes out a lot of the intimidation of voting and registering to vote. I wasn't able to put this in my presentation, but like historically registering to vote has been filled with a lot of intimidation, which is why a lot of Black and minority voters don't register. Like it used to be you could only register at like police and sheriff stations, which given the history of like Black and police like relationships, obviously that was intentional so that people didn't register to vote. So I think that what community initiatives offer is people that you know, people that you're comfortable with, people that represent your community are able to do something that might have originally been very intimidating to these voters. Yes.
Okay, I think maybe Bill was hitting on this a little bit with one of his questions, but are there specific groups that are kind of drawing up these new laws to be put in place in the state and local governments that are like lobbying to pass more restrictive voting in states? Did you find any of that in your research?
Are you talking about like specific,
Yeah,
more specifically than
organizations.
the Republican Party?
More specifically, like, are there groups, like specific companies?
An example that I can give you is when I was talking a little bit about Florida. I don't know if y'all remember, I can go back and say. I was talking about Florida. The group that was responsible for the purge methodology was known as Choice Point. So that is an example in the Florida election that was able to purge a lot of minority voters from the electorate rolls.
Wonder who's funding that, it'd be interesting to know.
Bryson, did you have another?
What is the most surprising thing or most interesting thing you learned through this process?
Yeah, teacher question.
What'd you say?
That sounds like a teacher question.
I didn't realize how long this has been happening. I think that was one of the most interesting things that obviously in the beginning, you can easily say only white males over the age of 21, but that's easy to say. But I didn't understand like how deep into like the foundation of our democracy were all of these systems of voter suppression. Not just who could vote, but how they could vote, and the specific like systems in place to make the franchise so discriminatory and not representative. Did you say you had one more question?
Does anyone else? Go ahead. You got anything else from the audience?
I don't think.
Go ahead.
Because this is an ongoing issue, how difficult was it to conduct your research, and was there a lot of bias that you had to shift through?
So that's honestly, I think the hardest part about my project was how contemporary this was, because I'd be writing about something and then I'd get a news alert on my phone that it changed. I don't really know what to do with that. So I would say it was really difficult to find. That's why, like, honestly, the history stuff, while it was less interesting to me in the beginning, it was honestly the easiest part to research because, like, it wasn't changing all the time. I think as far as, like, sorting through bias, it was kind of easier for me because, like, with the fraud situation and all of that biased media, I, like, was able, because of the literature, to, like, go into it knowing that it was biased. So, like, using those sources in a way that I already knew that, like, they were biased sources.
Interviews. I was going to ask missed opportunities, things you do differently with the project, especially regarding interviews of local activists or along those lines.
I would have loved to do some more I would have loved to do interviews. I think that would have been great. As far you said, things that
You differently,
wish that I could do
yeah.
differently. I would have loved, voter suppression is like, it's such a broad topic. I would have loved to talk about how other minority groups are disenfranchised. I would have loved to talk about how people with disabilities are disenfranchised, how women, all different people of color, Native American voting rights, like there's so many different people that are being suppressed that I think I wish that I had time, maybe in college, I'll be able to do on different groups as well. But I would say that's the biggest thing that I wish I could have done in my project. But interviews would have been great.
Great job. Thank you. Committee, let's come up and get a photo. All right, we'll have a 5-minute intermission here, and we'll move on. Committee members come up. Get a photo. I don't know.
Mom, our hair's
Someone who's got a good phone. We need to give a good phone. Yeah.
Sorry.
Hey, where are you?
I'm trying to get her.
Hey, where's some elbows? If you aren't drawing blood, you're not trying.
There were so many more screens like paparazzi up here.
Miss Sue, you're looking great. Look at that white outfit. Good job. Yeah.
No, she looks like an extra on Miami Vice.
Yeah, don't check. Yeah, I'm gonna give you three. I try to compliment you. It's like, yeah, Becca, because Harrison's out of town.
Imagine like all your work that you've done. I can even imagine.
You're going. Where'd Mama go?
Come on in, everyone. We're all set. Who are we missing?
Yeah, you need more chairs.
We've got some seats on the side here, guys.
We need to pull in some from the King's room.
We have about 4 chairs over there. Oh, okay, we got a couple coming in. Any more? Okay.
Maybe it's
Okay, we can do it. We got a minute. We're only 1 minute off.
Let us see one minute.
No.
Yeah.
Wait.
Jackson, you need a seat? Oh, my goodness. As a student of political science, obviously today is special because we have 2 topics that are, near and dear to me in the field of study that I've spent most of my life in. So this is really a cool day for thesis. Also, I want to plug the fact that both of these young ladies have been leaders in the school community, academic leaders. Layla, of course, one of our presidents of Amnesty International. Of course, our next presenter, Crady, of course, running the Model United Nations. And as it has grown and thrived, my Model UN people in here, thank you so much. It's been a great year for MUN. Definitely going to miss you guys next year. So I knew Crady was going to do something that was going to be probably political science, international relations related, and maybe something that would, hook in her interest in Chinese studies. So again, perfect topic, very timely topic, looking at the decline of American hegemony and the rise of China. And again, very special topic, right at about 100 pages. That sounds about right for the final draft that will be printed hopefully tonight. Anyways, let's give it up for Crady and Olive. All right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for being here today. My name is Crady Idola, and my project is Stars But No Stripes, the decline of American hegemony and the ascendance of China on the geopolitical and economic stage. My project aimed to analyze how the post-9/11 and 2008 financial crisis paradigms were emblematic of the decline of American power and influence, both economically and militarily. Furthermore, I seek to analyze how Chinese ascendance, independent and in conjunction to American declinism, and its implications that it would have on each other nations
geopolitical posturing. My literature review for this project was, just like the nature of the topic itself, incredibly fluid and ever-changing. I use a wide assortment of sources, including books, academic journals, podcasts, and documentaries. Some of the sources to note is Resh Doshi's The Long Game, as well as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Foreign Affairs Journal, as these provided monthly periodicals that had insightful analysis on the issue of China. I was also incredibly privileged to have met and discussed and have the guidance of former PA student Anna Ashton, who currently works as a senior fellow at the Asia Policy Institute. With that, we will now go into one of the major first sections of my project and deconstructing the decline of American hegemony. The premature and haphazard quote-unquote war on terror that was started by President George W. Bush oversaw the 9-year occupation of Iraq. These destabilized the Middle Eastern region and ironically became a catalyst for greater terrorism, as Iraq failed to become a successful state and rather became a breeding ground for many terrorist extremist groups, namely ISIS. Thousands of lives were lost and trillions of dollars were spent with no victories in the Middle East. And this punctured America's hubris and arrogance, highlighting how they assume that they will have military victory. Financialization refers to a greater prominence of financial actors, instruments, and motives within an economy. The 2008 financial crisis showcased the centrality of the American financial market and its gravitational pull on the rest of the world, as evidenced by the domino effect of markets crashing after the American financial crash. The lasting effects of this crisis were dual-pronged, having both domestic and international implications. Domestically, the crisis was indicative of the corrosive nature of financialization on the U.S. economy, as well as plutocracy on the American democracy. It also compromised the U.S.'s standing internationally, as it primarily deteriorated the U.S.'s role and the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. Dollar hegemony refers to the notion that the US dollar, being the global reserve currency and the preferred medium of international transactions, reaffirms political hegemony. Watered down, the dollar's influence in the global financial marketplace directly correlates and reaffirms the US's geopolitical hegemony. The financial crisis of 2008 exposed the vulnerabilities that the dollar and the American economy presented to the international community, that American investors willingly and knowingly engaged in morally hazardous practices. As evidenced by the graph on the screen, there is a declining trend of keeping U.S. bonds within foreign central banks. Additionally, countries around the world are now diversifying and keeping the bonds of currencies that they are geographically close to or have trade relations with. To determine the extent of declinism, as well as how significant Chinese ascendance was to potentially dethroning American hegemony, I utilized Susan Strange's lost hegemon theory. Strange herself is known to be one of the chief architects of international political economy and a major contributor towards the field of American declinism. She authored the lost hegemon theory in 1987 and still remains prevalent today. Strange denotes 4 main determinants that a hegemon must fulfill to maintain its role and keep its power. The first of which being the ability to threaten or protect other countries' physical security. A hallmark of American global security policy is, of course, NATO. Compared to the leadership that the U.S. exceeded in the 20th century and during the creation of NATO, U.S. leadership has declined in relation to the alliance. Currently, we see that President Donald Trump, while he was in power, had ominously threatened other allies within the alliance that they have to uphold their fiscal responsibilities to the alliance. And this brought into question whether or not the U.S. would actually act upon the interests of the entire alliance when push comes to shove. The ongoing Ukraine crisis has shown that NATO is once again at the forefront of the international community, but it begs the question of whether or not the U.S. will act in the interests of non-NATO countries. The second determinant that Strange identifies is the ability to control the global system of production in goods and services. China is unequivocally the manufacturing superpower as of recent and has an undeniable advantage in producing lower quality but also lower priced goods and the global marketplace. They have unparalleled manufacturing capabilities coupled with a robust labor market as well as cheap wages. This is evident and seen by China now trying to pivot into higher quality and higher end products, a marketplace that was previously cornered by the United States. The third lateral determinant that kind of couples with production is a hegemon's ability to shape the international capital market of finance and credit. As I formally went over in the earlier section about American decline, the US dollar is now at a compromised position in being the world's sole reserve currency. The CCP has been pursuing an aggressive monetary expansion policy to internationalize the Chinese renminbi and challenge dollar hegemony. As we can see with the graph on the screen, investment and expenditure is now more steadily and recently being utilized within the renminbi, and that more central governments are now holding renminbi bonds, which is showing that Chinese efforts are actually successful. The final, and in my opinion, most critical determinant is a hegemon's ability to direct the development, accumulation, and transfer of knowledge. America has enjoyed being a brain drain recipient, welcoming and absorbing young, educated talent from other developing countries. And they include them within the American marketplace and labor force. There's also an incredibly vital relationship between Chinese students and American educational institutions, as they comprise a majority of STEM majors in graduate and PhD programs, and considerably contribute towards any research papers that the US is able to publish. Students are beginning, however, to opt out entirely to having American degrees and pursuing American education. And if they do continue to do so, we see that they're quickly and swiftly returning back to the Chinese mainland with their American degrees. This phenomenon is going to come to the detriment of the United States as they were formerly a recipient. As we can see, there's a record low number of Chinese enrollments in American institutions, and American institutions themselves have done nothing to address this current phenomenon. The CCP itself has created its own incentivization program called the 100 Youths Program, which identifies and offers Chinese students, professionals, and scientists incentives to repatriate back to the mainland. This has come under the scrutiny of the American Department of Justice, who has alleged that correspondence and collusion with the CCP by any American resident or by any American citizen can be considered espionage. Now shifting away from Susan Strange's theories into larger geopolitical posturing, China has always prioritized securing the Southeast Asian region before thinking to pursue any global hegemonic ambitions, through what it has coined neighborhood diplomacy. The infamous Belt and Road Initiative began as a means to provide neighboring countries with the capital necessary to build infrastructure to facilitate trade. However, due to global demand, especially within Africa, for loans and capital, this has now grown to become a larger global policy. A historic and central tenet of Chinese geopolitical posturing is based on the war strategist Sun Yat-sen's famous saying that was later adopted by Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. Tao Guangyang Wei, Youshou Zhou Wei. This roughly translates to hide your capabilities and bide your time. Deng endorsed creating friendly relations and strong regional blocs rather than trying to make neighbors antsy due to Chinese militant or aggressiveness. He wanted to make sure that China's neighbors would not ally with the United States if push comes to shove. Xi Jinping, however, has seemingly denounced this historical precedent and pursued a more adventurous style of foreign policy, becoming more forthright and open about his ambitions to recreate a new world order that is serving in China's image. It begs the question of what will happen next as two clashing powers continue to vie for the spot of hegemon. Can they coexist, and what exactly may that entail? I will now dedicate the rest of my defense to looking at projection models and analyzing what serves towards the future of US-Chinese relations. Both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are incredibly similar in each other's styles of governance. Both employ personalistic, strongman, and nationalist rhetoric, but they differ in one key aspect. China's America First ideology resulted in a more isolationist foreign policy, whereas Xi Jinping has been incredibly expansionist in how he deals with other nations. This has resulted in lost opportunities for America that have now been incredibly detrimental to positioning and securing hegemony. China's Belt and Road Initiative and its sister policy, the String of Pearls, has addressed the fundamental of international demand for capital to industrialized developing nations. While the IMF and the World Bank are lenders, Chinese loans are still continuing to be seen as more attractive, as they do not place stringent prerequisites and conditions on nations who are wanting a loan. Trump and his predecessor Obama had failed to address this demand properly, and while Biden has attempted to create the Build Back Better World program with other G7 countries, China still continues to have a leading advantage. Additionally, Trump and the US walked out on discussions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and has allowed China to now establish its own regional cooperative economic partnership and further dominate the Asian Pacific marketplace. Trump alleged that China was economically raping the United States and attempted to pursue an economically protectionist policies, mainly starting off with his 2018 tariff war. While the intended target was meant to be U.S. industries and companies who were stealing American intellectual property, and more symbolically the CCP itself, American tariffs inflicted greater damage on domestic markets and companies. The war highlighted the interdependence between the two nations and their supply chains, and that neither country was in a position to be entirely self-reliant, and thus making economic decoupling an unviable option. Additionally, China leveraged its 1 billion plus consumer base and its advantages to economically coerce and deter multinational corporations from taking a pro-American stance, or even speaking out against the CCP. This can be most well illustrated with the NBA China case study. On October 4th, 2019, General Manager of the Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, tweeted out an image in solidarity with the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests. However, within the next 48 hours, we would see that Morey himself would issue an apology. Famous players within the league, such as LeBron James and Yao Ming, would come out and denounce his statements, and the league itself would try to distance itself from Morey's statements. When China developed its 2015 NBA China franchise, it was estimated that over $133 million worth of value was added to every team within the NBA. However, when Morey's tweets went live, it's estimated that over $100 to $150 million of revenue loss was incurred by the NBA. As long as countries continue to prioritize expanding into the Chinese marketplace and trying to capture Chinese consumers, China will continue to leverage predatory liberalism in its favor to ensure that multinational corporations are also working on their behalf. This coincides with another aspect of having and participating within the Chinese marketplace, which is entering joint venture agreements with Chinese companies. However, in doing so, Chinese companies and factories are now privy to previously proprietary information from American companies, facilitating for international property theft. This comes into a larger issue as to why there has been no actions taken by the WTO, but it seems that China will continue to mandate that American companies enter proprietary agreements. We will now be spending the rest of the presentation looking at models, starting first with a model that is still ongoing, and that's China's by at regional hegemony. China has built up its own created organization, namely ASEAN, as well as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. As previously mentioned, Xi Jinping has completely abandoned Deng Xiaoping's idea to hide your capabilities and bide your time, as well as the central tenets of neighborhood diplomacy, and has militarily seized the South China Sea. Despite many Southeast Asian allies beginning to turn against China and actually partner with the United States, China has made evidently clear that it will not leave the region. While there have been inklings that India could potentially serve as a counterweight within the region to potentially counter Chinese influence and hegemony, it's simply not viable at the time with the pre-existing capital and labor within India to take on a economic mapper like China. The second model explores global hegemony and what that would look like under China. As previously mentioned, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has a membership that spans almost the entire Asian continent and is actually continuing to expand eastward to include parts of Europe. The China and the SCO has made no inclination to try and extend any sort of diplomatic dialogue with the United States, but yet continues to be central to diplomatic dialogue internationally. The Belt and Road Initiative continues to prosper, and as we can see on the graph on the screen, almost virtually every nation in the world considers China to be among their top 3 trading nations. In this regard, a lot of trade facilitates diplomatic dialogue, and China will continue to hold a massive stronghold over most countries within the world. The last model that I'll be presenting, and perhaps the most dire, is a potential conflict within the South China Sea. Xi Jinping has made it explicitly blatant that he will try and reunify Taiwan by the Republic's centennial, so that's 2049. This also comes with strategic endeavors such as being able to have access to semiconductors. Any electronic device that we come in contact with today that includes and has circuitry within it is dependent upon semiconductors. And it's an area that neither China nor America has a strong lead on. However, Taiwan's semiconductor company, or TSMC, being located within Taipei, has given China more incentive to try and take over Taiwan. It will not do this on this notion alone. However, this is definitely a strategic benefit to trying to reunify Taiwan to the mainland. The U.S. is, however, trying to act proactively by entering into alliances, namely with Filipino President Duterte, to have naval presence within the South China Sea, so that if any conflict were to erupt, the U.S. military can quickly mobilize and go approach the island. In summation, China and America have the ability to change course if they commit to a grand strategy of multilateralism, with both addressing domestic inequality, but also having a less conflict-based relationship. If the U.S. commits to global leadership, it could potentially continue to hold its spot for hegemony. As Thucydides, the famous Greek philosopher, once stated, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this inspired in Sparta that made the Peloponnesian War inevitable. We would hate to see what that war would bring upon for American and Chinese citizens alike, but it is an ever-evolving conflict. With that, I now yield my time to questions. Before I do have any questions, though, I do want to thank everybody who's in this room. My entire thesis committee, Ms. Laura Beard and Ms. Rachel Prim for all of their support throughout this entire project. To Mr. Bill Toppich, I would have never, loved the field of international relations the way I do if not for his teachings. For my family, for quite literally just getting off a plane from India to be here with me today. They never failed to support me in so many ways. And lastly, in dedication, I dedicate this entire project to my alma. I knew she would have loved to be here today with me, and that she would be incredibly proud of this incredible achievement. This next month without her will be incredibly hard, but I hope that she is smiling upon us today with happiness. So thank you.
Part of the Chinese ambition, cloaking some of the domestic problems they may be facing regarding things like not just the Uyghurs in Tibet, Hong Kong, the aging population. Is part of this a strategy by Xi Jinping to kind of cloak or hide, bury some of these domestic issues and look at the foreign ambition as being more important and international policy being more important?
Well, that's a very interesting point that you bring up, and something that has actually gone against America. A lot of people like to say that America is currently incredibly domestically fractured. We see that with the Black Lives Matter movement, inequality being at an all-time high, that the U.S. is unable to perform the way that it has for the last first decade of its hegemony, whereas China seems to have their act together a little bit more. But it definitely is a means of projecting power globally while trying to mask a lot of the issues that China faces internally.
Is this a question of Chinese regional hegemony, or is this more of a stretch possibly for global dominance and global hegemony? I mean, is that an overstretch? What was the literature saying on this?
A lot of the literature states that global hegemony is actually not without China's reach. It would be a stretch to say that it will be attained within possibly the next decade, but China has laid down all of the foundational work that it needs, namely through the BRI, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other institutions to potentially lead the path towards global hegemony. Like I discussed within defense itself, China needs to first absolutely secure regional hegemony, and it continues to try and do so. But global hegemony is not out of reach.
Ms. Beard or Ms. Prim, whoever wants to jump in.
Sure. This is really recent, but I wondered if you could say something about the ways that the recent COVID outbreak in China has exposed some of the weak points of an authoritarian regime, and how or why they might have been able to disguise some of the weaker points of what's maybe inherently unstable about an authoritarian regime.
Well, it's very interesting because China actually proudly talks about how it is the first nation to reopen, the first nation to get back up on its feet after the COVID pandemic. But like you said, the Sinopharm vaccination that is currently being distributed in China seems to not acknowledge or account for a lot of these strains, thus resulting in China now reclosing as recently as last week. So China has prided itself on its ability to actually leverage its authoritarianism, calling democracy an incredibly long and stringent process that doesn't account for time-sensitive issues, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. China has actually talked about how the politicalization of vaccines and masking here in the United States would be kind of a fantasy within China and something that probably America wishes upon China because it was able to more quickly account for and kind of deal with the COVID-19 outbreak.
I was just wondering, towards the end, you were talking about kind of multilateralism, kind of maybe being like the key. Do you think that maybe the solution isn't, or part of the problem is that China's trying to be the hegemon, the United States is trying to keep its hegemony, and so because of that, you're just constantly having, these battles and the theft of intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe the key is there isn't one that maybe it's a cooperation. I was wondering if you could elaborate on your multilateralism.
Well, while there's a possibility that hegemony itself could become decentralized and that there could be multiple hegemons, that would only exclusively exist with regional hegemons, but there would still need to be kind of still one alpha top dog. And as is, China and the US cannot seem to both share the spot of hegemony. They see the other nation having hegemony as a direct threat to themselves, and thus have to do everything within their power, may that be economically implementing tariffs or going through protectionist policies, or militarily, kind of doing this, show off of naval capabilities within the South China Sea to kind of make the other nation back down. However, we see that with the Trump and Xi Jinping eras, neither nation was willing to back down, and Biden is continuing off of the policies of his predecessor. So it'll be interesting to see how Biden, who seems to have a little bit more seems a bit more pro-multilateral foreign policy, will still continue to kind of engage with China, but also not back down.
Any questions?
Great job. Actually, no, I'm still formulating questions.
I'll jump in with one more that I wanted to ask. It seems that China under Xi Jinping is abandoning its Confucius value structure. Central part of Chinese culture seems to be going by the wayside. The arrogance, the hubris of China
Has there been any backlash against that? And do you feel that is the trend we're seeing with the abandonment of Confucius value structure?
Well, it's interesting because China domestically is trying to actually utilize Confucianism to its advantage. Xi Jinping is trying to also kind of make his presidency akin to that of the mandate of heaven, saying that he was predestined and the ultimate leader of China and leading China to its golden age, where it can return prior to when it first went under European influence under the Opium Wars 1 and 2. So it's very interesting to see that while we here in America kind of interpret that a lot of the arrogance that is very similar to American arrogance that China is now showcasing might be anti-Confucianist, Xi Jinping actually counters that and says that it's not only more Confucianist, but it's also more Maoist. Also kind of going back towards the legitimacy of the roots, the revolutionary roots of the Republic as a whole.
So you very, very briefly mentioned China's role in Africa. And I'd like for you maybe to expand on that a little bit more and how building, infrastructure and what China's doing in Africa helps to expand their hegemony in the region.
Well, to put it bluntly, it's a new form of colonialism, neocolonialism. And China's kind of engaging in it with the understanding that if they create the infrastructure necessary, that they can further broaden international trade, that they will accumulate more international trade partners within Africa, this untapped resource, because the U.S. is no longer willing to invest or even intervene in African conflicts. So it's very interesting to see how China is completely reinventing the scramble for Africa. But in many regards, no other nation has caught on, and also noticed how incredibly predatory the BRI has been. Many have posited that a lot of the loans that China has been giving contribute to debt trap diplomacy, but it's kind of a chicken and an egg situation where a lot of these countries are underdeveloped and therefore unable to pay back Chinese loans, and by default are kind of becoming a part of debt trap diplomacy. But as a whole, China would not want to indebt a bunch of African nations because it further corrodes their international image. While Xi Jinping may turn away from hydro capabilities and biding time, he definitely does not want to create enemies out of the entire African continent.
Committee member audience members? You decide.
Oh, me?
I remember a lot of times in thesis class, I would hear like you and Talbridge talking about the theories. So I was just wondering, like, how did that kind of help your project? How would you say that impacted your project?
Sure. Well, I think that at some points became a runaway train. There is so many theories in literature analyzing geopolitics, power structures, and conflicts. And there's just so much history that you can look back upon. Like I said in the last slide, Thucydides, who comes from ancient Athens, he even had his own theories and contributions that still apply to the Chinese power politics. So it's incredibly, I kind of got lost in the weeds in the middle of the project, but I definitely think with Topshi's guidance and support, we were able to kind of slim that down, into the works of Robert Keeling, Robert Gilpin, Susan Strange, and a few others. But sadly, I didn't have time with the minutes to actually talk about those.
So I remember last year in comparative, we talked a lot about how an authoritarian model can yield to a lot of efficiency. How would you say like America's liberal democracy model and China's more like soft authoritarian model, how is that impacting this dynamic?
But definitely think about it this way. Every 4 years, we have a new executioner and a new vision. What America is changes every 4 years. How we interact with the geopolitical change on the geopolitical stage alters every 4 years. Whereas Xi Jinping is now approaching his decade in power, and he has been incredibly efficient and incredibly focused on exactly what he wants the entire international community to think of and see China as. This is actually a point that I talked about within my thesis, how liberal democracy in some cases is inefficient to try and create this larger grand strategy. If a US president attempted to create the Belt and Road Initiative, I would guarantee that American taxpayers and the American electorate would go up in arms about how much the US government would be aiding American banks and giving out loans. However, it's unique that China is authoritarian and allows it to kind of challenge American hegemony and so quick as well. Like,
Can I go off of what Harrison was saying about like the efficiency of the authoritarian government? When you look at like the past couple of decades, the world's like globalized a lot, and we've seen like more open, like a faster open world. How do you think like that rise in globalization has affected your topic?
sure. So globalization has definitely been to the advantage of China. Something that, again, kind of got cut from my defense slides, the topic I delved into within the project itself is how production and production processes have actually been fragmented. This is in the advent of globalization and a way in which to incentivize nations to participate in the global economy. In this King's class, I like to use the analogy of a potluck. All of the nations of the world are all people who are attending a potluck, and we want everybody to bring a different dish to the dinner. However, we're starting to see that China, in an attempt to be more self-reliant and protectionist, is starting to try and make all the dishes themselves and start cutting off other partners so that they can accumulate the most amount of capital. And in many ways, China has been, once again, successful in doing so because it's able to leverage its authoritarian government to give its own companies loans, subsidies, and other incentives that U.S. companies just simply do not have. Julianne.
You mentioned earlier the relationship between President Duterte and Trump. What do you think is the reason why countries like the Philippines are still maintaining such close relationships with the United States despite China's stronghold on their economy? And do you see this trend happening in other countries as well?
Well, Duterte is kind of an interesting case study because he himself aspires to be the strongman, personalistic, authoritarian leader, similar to Putin, Trump, and Xi Jinping himself. In fact, actually, relationships between Duterte and Trump under the Trump administration was actually not as amicable and open as it now is under the Biden administration. But it is still interesting to note that the Philippines realizes that if the Chiang Dynasty does militarize, that its Navy alone cannot take on the PLA, and that it will need the guidance and help of its allies, including the United States, to help ward off potential war coming towards Philippine borders.
This is kind of going off of your answer to Harrison's question. So, would you argue that like a democracy or an authoritarian regime wouldn't necessarily work for other places? Like, it wouldn't necessarily be right for China to try to implement democracy. It wouldn't be right for the U.S. to try to like implement an authoritarian regime. Like, how do you think?
Right. So it's interesting to see because I would argue that India is like the perfect combination of both. They claim that they are a democracy, yet we see that Narendra Modi himself is once again trying to emulate the strongman personalistic style of governance. And we can see that when you're unable to define yourself or put yourself in one of these boxes, that the nation as a whole suffers. Narendra Modi wants to push nationalism within its domestic borders and try and become a regional hegemon, but he cannot seem to multitask and efficiently push both. In many regards as well, the US and China have industrial and manufacturing capabilities that simply no other nation on the planet currently possesses. So any other nation that would wish to vie for hegemony and be among the ranks of the US or China would first have to attain this level of development. Kate.
So for the Olympics, whenever Putin and Xi Jinping met, how would like cooperation in this kind of alliance change the dynamics and like alter dominance on the global stage for China?
For sure. Xi Jinping backing Putin is unequivocally a blow to any of the inroads that China has made over, like, say, the past few years. Going and standing side by side to Putin and also kind of saying, we want to use you as a guinea pig to see how the international community will react to an invasion of a sovereign state is incredibly important. I would argue that now China would have to wait and postpone any plans to invade Taiwan, seeing the international condemnation and the swift alliance that formed among most countries against Putin. It is also important to note that China is still abetting Putin in allowing them to subvert a lot of the and circumvent a lot of the ongoing American-based tariffs. But if China could seem to underline and downplay this alliance as much as possible, it could potentially reroute the course back onto creating more multilateralism, creating more diplomatic dialogue. Because if it continues to have a heavy association with Putin, there could be barriers towards reaching regional and/or global shift.
I know you cut a lot from your presentation. What's either the most important thing or your favorite thing that ended up on the kind of report on this presentation?
There was so much, but I do have to say I kind of got into this rabbit hole and really learned a lot about this concept and the corrosive nature of American plutocracy. This is something that is just so incredibly rich, talking about how the middle and upper class are leveraging their wealth to kind of co-opt any system of governance. And in many ways, it's so interesting to note that the US is one of the nations, like the US is separating this, but China is actually not. Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign has been incredibly effective in telling a lot of Chinese billionaires, hey, you might have money, but I'm the boss at the end of the day. Whereas here in the US, we're starting to see the Citizens United case, and that, of course, still going in favor of plutocrats, that American billionaires are still able to buy off politicians and congressional agendas. And this was something that, honestly, I didn't even think that I was going to embark into, but I would have loved to do its own, like, senior thesis project on that. So it's definitely something that I feel incredibly passionate and like invigorated by, but sadly something that takes quite a while to explain, so it has to be done in the presentation.
Real quick to close up, any advice you'd give? There's a lot of potential thesis students over the next few years in the room. Any advice you'd give them? Suggestions?
Sure. I would say that thesis is genuinely one of the most rewarding experiences of your academic career. I would say to like, it's a process in which you learn so much about yourself as a scholar, but also just as a person. Can I wake up early in the morning to write those extra 7 pages, or am I gonna have to crank it out at 12 p.m.? I don't know. But like, thesis will definitely open your eyes to that. I'll say that I definitely felt passionate and very happy with my topic because it's going to lead into my future studies in college. But also, if you have any passions that are non-academic, still continue and still, think that those are valid thesis projects and that you might actually enjoy that a little bit more than something as dense as international relations policy and theory. So, enjoy it, don't procrastinate, but enjoy the entire journey.
Stevie, we didn't have any questions.
Oh, yes, Stevie. You have a question for me? Perhaps how am I still standing in these heels?
Let's do it as a first slide. Oh, you want to do that first? Yeah, and we'll get a photo. Did we get one before you started? No. Okay, let's get one of you by the slide. Good turnout. Academics are alive and well. Those of you guessed the PA, I guarantee would see this at any other school anywhere in any part of the country. It's cool to be smart here, and these kids are evidence of that. Look at Zach, he's chilling there after you up there. Look at you. Life is good. Are you getting? We'll get her first. We'll get All right.
Oh, I didn't vomit.
You like over here. I'll come back. That's fine.
We're still, I can do it.
No, no. You guys come back.
Well, it is a franchise. It's still our real story, so.
I like how Harrison likes, he's plugging his thesis stuff. You'll hear more about this tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of underclassmen showing up. That's good. Keep on trying.
That makes me excited.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. That means the world to me.